Her hair made her an enduring symbol of 1970s black power. Her politics made her a revolutionary, a communist, and then a fugitive. She was only 26 years old when the FBI put her on the 10 most wanted list. She spent months underground and then in jail until an all-white jury acquitted her and set her free. But her time in prison changed her. 4 decades later, she's the best-known prison abolitionist in the United States. I met her in Oakland, California, to talk about incarceration in the land of the free, capitalism in a time of economic crisis, and what it means to be the face of black power in a supposedly post-racial America. Her name is Angela Davis, and she's my guest on this special edition of Inside USA.
In the 16 months I spent in jail, I experienced some of what so many of my sisters and brothers have been experiencing for many, many years.
Even if she is convicted of murder, Miss Davis could no longer receive the death penalty. So, after the bond money was paid, Angela Davis was released on bail. She must now live with people approved by the court, must not attend any rallies without court approval, and not leave the San Francisco Bay Area.
Angela Davis, welcome to Inside USA.
Thank you.
Something I was reminded of during the election campaign, when the New Yorker cover with that famous caricature of Michelle and Barack Obama, which was supposed to represent the apotheosis of white fear of the Obamas. But the Michelle Obama character with the famous afro and the Black Power iconography, that was you in some way. Did you think that when you saw that?
I didn't necessarily read it as myself. I read it as a figure from that era.
A figure that you know you've been sort of packaged as at various...
Yeah, exactly.
And so 40 years after you were actually on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list, what does it tell you that that construction is still so feared?
Well, it tells me something about what you might call the historicity of political rhetoric. It tells me about the existence of a memory, institutional memory, that sometimes eludes us as individuals. And I'm really interested in institutional memory because I think that the institutions like the prison system retain the memory of slavery, retain the memory of segregation, and somehow or another there's a connection to the collective psyche. So even though people might not now, particularly those who weren't born during that period, they might not be able to articulate why such an image strikes fear in their hearts. Nevertheless, it's still there. And
yet the genius of Obama as a political phenomenon is supposed to be the representation of a post-racial society. You must have struggled with this terminology.
Well, yes, because I don't believe we have reached the point where it is possible to extricate ourselves from the logic of race, from the work that race does. And that is because racism still is very much a phenomenon affecting particularly poor people and working class people. Yeah, I think we find ourselves at a pivotal moment. This historical conjuncture is very, very interesting. It's interesting in the sense that the media, especially, have forgotten how to talk about issues of race. And whenever a story emerges that has something to do with race, it kind of creates chaos. And that ought to tell people that we haven't yet dealt with race.
That we're not done.
We're definitely not done.
And yet I've talked to so many Democrats this year who say, despite the fact that racism is still present in American society as it is in all societies, Barack Obama might be president, that this is somehow victory for the civil rights movement that seemed to be snuffed out when Martin Luther King and others were assassinated.
Well, I would not say that by itself the election of a black person as president can be claimed as a victory for the civil rights movement. But I do think that what's exciting about the current campaign is that there's been an unprecedented mobilization of people, young people who have never wanted to have anything to do with the electoral process in this country. And that, to me, is what is so exciting.
Does it not also say something, though, about the limitations of the civil rights movement, that individuals ascending to heights in society is claimed as a general victory?
Absolutely. And you know, what's interesting, and I actually have been thinking about this recently, has been this contradictory consequence of equality before the law, because one can argue that every one of the people behind bars today has had due process. They've been considered as equal rights-bearing subjects before the law. But the fact is, the law cannot apprehend anything beyond that the individual who has no race, who has no gender, who is an abstract rights-bearing subject. And that is why, in a sense, you might say the victories of the civil rights movement have assisted us in filling up the prisons with poor people and people of color, because the law can't talk about or can't see the circumstances that would enable a trajectory that leads toward prison for one person, but enable a trajectory that leads towards, say, Harvard for another person.
What do you make of this particular political economic moment?
Well, I think it raises a much larger question, a question about the nature of capitalism in this country, in the world. I think it raises questions about increasing privatization, and we're talking about the transfer of funds that come from taxpayers' pockets, from the earnings of working class people to some of the largest financial corporations in the world. If we look at the trend toward privatization that has been happening since, say, the 1980s, privatization of healthcare, privatization of education, and what has, of course, interested me in terms of the work that I do, the privatization of prisons, we can see that there is this juggernaut of privatization that is devouring the resources of people all over the world.
One of the features that certainly that we've noticed traveling the United States over the past year is how many people are not even in the conversation. And I've been struck in the unfolding of this economic financial crisis of what a small number of people are actually involved in proposing the solutions and enacting them and batting it back and forth. But where are all the poor people in the United States?
You know, I think the invisibility is an imposed invisibility. It may be the case that the projects are being torn down, and of course, as we know, in New Orleans, the projects, which were still structurally sound, which could have been renovated, those projects were torn down largely because the new plans for the city of New Orleans have no place for poor people. So the poverty can be seen, for example, in the increased numbers of people who are behind bars, the increased numbers of people who are under the direct control of the criminal justice system. Just some months ago, the Pew Center released this report indicating that 2.3 million people were behind bars, that the U.S. has now 25% of the entire world's incarcerated population.
What does it say about the United States that the level of incarceration here is so much higher than either comparable capitalist democracies in Europe or elsewhere, or even countries like China?
Well, I think what it says is that in the U.S. there are structural ways of hiding the poverty to which you were inferring. It is not generally the case that we think about prisons as places where poverty lives, but this is a very good example of using the prison system as a depository for all of the problems associated with poverty. So it's not just that individuals who commit crimes are arrested, it's that individuals who are placed on a trajectory that leads them directly to prison are placed there because of the fact that they don't have the opportunity to get an education, and therefore they are, for the most part, illiterate. They have not been able to find the jobs, particularly given the deindustrialization of the economy.
It's impossible for me to listen to you talk about that way without it sounding like there was or is a plan to store surplus humanity.
Well, I'm not suggesting that there's a conspiracy that, men hover over a table in a dark room and decide how can. It's a structural way that's already built into the criminal justice system. I mean, the fact that some decades ago, there were no more than 200,000 people behind bars, and the fact that there are more than 10 times as many people indicates that the prison system is being used for something that is very different from controlling crime. I mean, it's never worked in terms of controlling crime, not since the Advent. It's never worked.
The incarceration rate is in no statistical way related to the crime levels.
Oh, absolutely not. As a matter of fact, in recent years, as the crime rate has fallen, the incarceration rate has gone up. It's not vice versa. The incarceration rate has gone up, therefore the crime rate has gone down. It's exactly the opposite correlation.
I want to talk more about the abolition of prisons, because that is a truly subversive idea, but we have to take a break first. We'll be back with more of this interview with Angela Davis in a minute.